Good morning, America. Today I'm going to talk about colonialism in the 19th and early 20th centuries. All right, colonialism is a very important aspect of history in this era, and it goes right along with the Industrial Revolution that we were talking about, that I talked about in my last video, because the colonialism and the Industrial Revolution go hand in hand, because when you have industry, you need resources, raw materials, ingredients for all those factories to make stuff out of. Well, where do those raw ingredients come from? Well, for most European countries, those raw materials come from colonies. Now, the big exception to that is the United States. The United States is a major industrial power in the 19th century. The Industrial Revolution came to America shortly after it began in Britain. America doesn't really have or need colonies in the 19th century, though, because America is so big and that it has all the resources it needs here at home. However, once you get into the 20th century, even America gets in on the colony game a little bit. But for European countries especially, it's colonies are the name of the game. That's where they're going to get the raw materials and resources that are necessary. Now, another aspect of colonialism is just it was tradition. European countries had colonies ever since the discovery of the New World by Columbus. But it takes on this added push because of the Industrial Revolution. Now, another thing that changes, though, compared to in 19th and 20th century colonialism versus the times before that, dating back to Columbus, is where the colonies are. In the 15, 16, and 1700s, of course, most of the colonies were in the New World, particularly Spain's colonial empire. But by the time you get to the 19th century, you don't really have very many colonies in the Western Hemisphere anymore. The United States breaks free from Great Britain, of course, in 1776, and then the rest of the Western Hemisphere, inspired by our example, follows suit within a few years. Haiti breaks free from France in 1796. Louisiana Territory is sold to the United States in 1803. And then all of Central and South America breaks free from Spain and Portugal in the early 1800s, between 1810 and 1850 or thereabouts. All of Central and South America breaks free, and European countries are not able to regain those colonies because of the watchful eyes of the United States, protecting the rest of the Western Hemisphere with the Monroe Doctrine, which says basically Europe hands off the rest of the Western Hemisphere. This is our backyard, you got to stay out of it. So the Western Hemisphere, once the United States starts to become at least moderately powerful in the 19th century and asserts the Monroe Doctrine, the Western Hemisphere is really off limits for European colonization. And Spain and Portugal lose their colonies in the Western Hemisphere in the early 1800s. But there's no lack of other places on Earth to colonize, and so European countries turn longing eyes on Asia and Africa, particularly Africa. So in the 17 and 1800s, you have strengthening of you have increasing colonization in Asia. India is taken over by Britain and becomes a British colony. In the 1700s, it was ruled by the British East India Company. In the 1800s, it switched to being ruled by Britain directly. Britain also, various European countries, Britain and the Netherlands, take over most of Southeast Asia. Japan and China are too powerful to be colonized outright by European countries. But various Western countries succeed in intimidating Japan and China to the point that they at least are willing to trade with the West. So Great Britain and other European countries forced China to make concessions to allow them to trade, and the United States forces Japan to make concessions to start trading with them. However, the biggest pot of gold for colonization in the 1800s, other than arguably India itself, which belongs to Britain, is Africa. There is, historians speak of the scramble for Africa in the mid to late 1800s. Basically, at the start of the 1800s, you have just a string of European colonies around the coast of Africa, like beads on a string, tracing out the coastline of the African continent. Those were old European colonies. Most of them were for the purpose of slave trading. There were a few exceptions, but most of them were for the purpose of slave trading. However, the interior of the sub-Saharan African continent was almost completely unknown to Europeans. But that changed rapidly. Europeans moved in, they explored it, and they started colonizing it. And in the 1800s, Africa gets sliced up like a pie. By the end of the 1800s, there are hardly any parts of Africa that are not colonies of European powers. By 1900, there are only 2 countries in Africa that are not European colonies. Ethiopia, which is an ancient kingdom that still clung to its independence, and Liberia, which was founded by an American nonprofit organization, but was never actually an outright colony of the United States. Now, there are, as we move into what colonialism looks like, there were good sides and bad sides to colonialism, and I have splurged on some color markers to help us distinguish between them. I'm going to talk about first the good and then the bad sides of colonialism. The good side of colonialism was that colonialism at its best could have a certain benevolence to it. I think the ideal that the European countries aspire, well, let's put it this way, European countries didn't deliberately set out to say we are going to be mean and racist to the natives. That's generally not their stated intention. Their stated intention is that we are going to help the natives and be nice to them. And sometimes they live up to that, sort of. So colonialism at its best can be benevolent. What does that benevolence look like? Well, it can look like things like building infrastructure, for example. Roads, cities, schools, railroads, and some of this colonial era infrastructure continued to continue to provide benefit for the locals long after the Europeans were gone. For example, Europeans built railroads in a railroad in Kenya, and a railroad in Ethiopia. The French built a railroad from Djibouti to Addis Ababa, and that railroad still continued to be in use long after the European colonists were gone. Same thing for the railroad built in Kenya from Mombasa to Nairobi. And it's only been very recently that those colonial era railroads have been upgraded and replaced in modern times. So you have infrastructure that's being built that was helpful to the local peoples, at least in some instances. You also have the benefits of Western science and medicine coming in. So, the Europeans, they may have clinics, build hospitals, that sort of thing. You also have an opening for missions. Missionaries follow close behind the colonists. And when we're talking about the 1800s, we're not generally talking about Catholic monks that are forced converting people. We're talking about actual real missionaries, Protestant missionaries typically, who are offering to share who are doing their best to share the gospel with the natives. Now, sometimes they didn't always go about it the best way. They sometimes the version of the gospel they shared is kind of like the gospel is tied up with the culture of whatever European country they're from. And in order to be a Christian, you also have to adopt the European culture, which is bad because Christianity is not dependent on any one culture. You can be of any culture and be a Christian. So, to the extent that Christianity was tied to a particular culture, that was bad. But there is genuine sharing of the gospel. There are churches that get founded, and there are people that get saved. So, that's to the good. However, there are a lot of bad aspects of colonialism. And one of the worst is the real reason for colonialism, aside from all the posturing about, oh, we're here to help the natives, the real reason there is exploitation of resources. What those resources are varies from place to place, but ultimately it's all about the resources. That can be things like rubber, ivory, various minerals. And India, it could be opium, all kinds of different things. But it's often about the exploitation of resources. Another bad thing that came out of colonialism is a legacy of political oppression. The United States knew a thing about this, since we felt like we were being oppressed by Great Britain when we declared our independence. But we had it easy compared to what a lot of the 19th century and 20th century era colonies went through. A lot of the European countries, they ruled to a greater or lesser extent with a rod of iron. The regime that's set up is intended to benefit the white colonists first and foremost, and the locals only a distant second. Now, some of them were worse than others, though. Probably the single worst run colony in the whole world was Belgian Congo. Now, Belgium you normally think of as like, oh, waffles and chocolate and stuff. But when it comes to colonization in the 19th century, little Belgium turns into a raving monster with their colony in Africa. Belgian Congo was considered the personal property of King Leopold II. Leopold was interested primarily in two things, rubber and ivory. By the way, he never actually set foot there. This is just his minions doing his dirty work for him. So they would do things like they would kidnap the natives and then tell their families, okay, if you ever want to see your loved ones back again, you have to pay us a ransom of such and such amount of ivory or rubber. Or they'll just take in villages and enslave them and put them to work, that type of thing. A lot of people died. It's estimated that millions of people died in Belgian Congo in Leopold II's unceasing quest for resources, which puts Leopold II on the list of the top 10 mass murderers of all history, astonishingly enough, or at least of modern history, which is surprising to a lot of people, but it's true. Belgian Congo was an outlier. Most colonies were not that catastrophically oppressive. However, even the best-run colonies were at least a little bit oppressive, and most colonies are somewhere in between. India, the British colonies are better run than Belgian Congo, but they're still somewhat oppressive to the locals. You have racial segregation. You know, the locals are intended to be, viewed as common laborers, hewers of wood and drawers of water, and, look after the kids and serve me my tea at 3 o'clock, please, with the right amount of crumpets and toast. But, they don't, equal rights? You gotta be kidding me. They're just locals. So, it's still a little bit oppressive. Even the United States got in on the oppression thing a little bit. The Philippines that we took from Spain in the Spanish-American War was American colony from 1900 to 1950, and they tried to establish their independence, and we fought a war against them. to prevent them from keep getting their independence and killed some of them. So even the United States got in on the oppression at least a little bit. And the third bad legacy of colonialism is that it sows the seeds for future conflict. Now, eventually, all these colonies are going to declare their independence, or almost all of them. Most of the African colonies and Asian colonies declare their independence after World War II. So most of the Asian colonies achieved their independence between 1945 and 1960. Or between 1945 and 1955, excuse me. Most of the African colonies achieved their independence between 1955 and 1975. The average African country achieved its independence in about 1963 or 64. The legacy of colonialism is that it sows the seeds for future conflicts, because oftentimes the colonies, when they achieve their independence, the boundary of the country is based off of what the boundary of the colony was. But the boundaries of the colonies were arbitrarily drawn by European countries. They don't actually match real world conditions, and oftentimes you wind up with multiple ethnic groups trapped in one country that hate each other for historical reasons. And so they can't coexist peacefully in one country. They have no business trying to be in one country with each other, but they're trapped in the same country with each other. And so that sows the seeds for civil wars, for wars between countries, for coups, uprisings, oppression of all different shapes and sizes. And so that's given rise to wars in places everywhere from India and Sri Lanka to Nigeria, and everywhere in between. There have been wars since the end of World War II that are directly connected to the legacy of colonialism. So to sum up colonialism, there were some benefits, but I view these benefits as almost being like the silver lining of the cloud, or maybe like a God's grace kind of thing. But I think the bad outweighed the good, because it was brutally exploitative in the worst of circumstances, and mildly exploitative even under the best of circumstances. It was politically oppressive, and it sowed the seeds for future conflict. Alright, I think that about sums it up for colonialism. There could be more that said, of course, but I think that gives us the basic overview. Alright, see you next time. Bye.